Welcome back, everybody. This is grade 2 of the Carrot Poker School, and we're on to lecture 7. Today's topic is facing bets. We're going to be on the other side of the equation for the first time in detail in the school, and we're going to be talking today about thresholds. The thresholds we're going to be identifying are going to concern various points in our range that represent where we may start raising for value, calling, folding, raising as a bluff, that sort of thing. Knowing where these key points are within our range is going to be the first ingredient to being a holistically successful poker player and being able to understand not just what your hand wants to do, but where it fits into the overall template. This is such a powerful tool to master, so let's get started. Our warm-up exercise today concerns being in the big blind and facing this R33 from button. In case you've forgotten, an R33 is simply going to denote a bet with all of button's range for 33% of the pot. We have 3 options when this happens. We can raise, we can call, or we can fold. And the first question for you guys to pause the video and think about is, what is the pot odds norm against this sizing? Assuming you've done that, the pot odds norm is of course 25%. This is always going to be the expected fold equity in a neutral world, or a B33, but of course this is anything but a neutral world. This is purely theoretical. Will big blind overfold or underfold relative to this number, and why? Pause the video, have a think, write down a thought or two, and assuming you've done that, the answer is of course that big blind is going to overfold a texture that's this hostile. This is a very disadvantageous flop for the big blind's range because the king has a much greater prevalence and concentration within the range of the button raiser than it does within the range of the big blind caller. Not only that, but there aren't really any of the danger zone cards here that big blind's range would favour. Something between a 5 and an 8 would really help big blind catch up, especially where multiple variants of those cards were present and straight draws or straights were abundant. As it is, we have 2 completely low and brickish cards that are just out with the danger zone due to the fact that they're not really selected pre-flop for defense within the big blind, and the king is just one of the best cards in the deck for the button. This is definitely a flop where the EV is very high, and there's going to be a great deal of overfolding going on here. Against range bet, the overfolding will be less than against a more selective c-bet strategy, but there's still going to be a great deal more fold equity than 25% here for button, and that's why button is completely justified in adopting a range bet strategy. Where do you think the indifference point is between calling and folding with respect to the following couple of brackets of hand? Firstly, hands with showdown value, and secondly, those without showdown value. Pause the video and have a think. Well, when it comes to hands with showdown value, we're going to see this in just a second, but you can maybe defend a little bit wider than you would think here. When you're facing an R33, you have to remember that you can't have really strict considerations about what you can call and what you can't. If you adopt arbitrary criteria such as I need a pair to continue, you're definitely going to be way too tight on this node. So let's look to defend hands that have some brute force showdown value of the ilk of something like Ace-8, Ace-7 backdoor, that sort of thing. Of course, there's a fine line between having redraw equity and not, and do we really want to consider Ace-8 of diamonds as just a showdown value hand given it has redraw? Well, it's mostly showdown value, but of course if something has a backdoor flush draw, you can defend a bit lower down in terms of showdown value than you can if it doesn't. Hands without showdown value that you can call here would be anything really in the vicinity of Jack 10 suited, Jack 9, Queen 10, these kinds of hands. I mean, these do have a little tiny wisp of showdown value on certain boards, but they're usually going to have to improve or bluff to win. These ones can call, as can any gut shot like 4-6, 4-5 or something like that. Hands that you wouldn't really want to continue with here would be something like a 7-6, just a little bit too flimsy to call. How often do you think big blind will raise this c-bet? Of course, we don't know big blind's hand, but what do you think will be the global raise frequency with big blind's range in this situation against button? Pause the video and have a think. If you thought it would be very low because this is an unfavourable board for big blind, you're completely wrong. You have to remember that how many large investments you want to make is actually a function of how polarised your range is compared to that of the opponent, and not of range equity. While equity controls the overall frequency of investing some sort of bet, it's actually going to be nut advantage / relative polarization that's going to determine how much raising goes on. When button bets everything here, button is incredibly merged. Button actually has more mediocre hands than big blind here due to having combos like 9s through jacks, ace queen, ace jack, ace 10, etc. at a higher frequency. Big blind's range, however, is a lot more hit or miss. It's kind of king X and then it's nothing. There isn't really a high density of pocket pairs in big blind's range because it's a late position spot where the range is so diluted by other combinations. In essence here, big blind's range is actually not that merged compared to buttons and is quite polarized. Therefore, big blind will usually want to adopt a strategy against the ultimate merged action of range betting of raising fairly often, and we actually see that the raise frequency globally speaking for big blind here is over 20%. This shocks a lot of people, but you have to remember that raising falls under the bracket of a large investment because you're pushing that pot more quickly towards the investment ceiling than you have to, and therefore it's more controlled by polarization and less by overall equity. It's not uncommon in poker on the flop to actually be folding way more than pot odds norm and suffering in terms of EV, but still doing a lot of your defending by raising. What are some of the worst looking hands that are allowed to bluff raise? These will be some fairly skeptical looking backdoors that look a bit too weak to invest but actually have enough going on through a combination of pair draw, backdoor draw to the nuts, and of course unblocking the dead suit, which is hearts. So having something like the 7-5 here of diamonds isn't as bad as it looks when you add all of that together, but you wouldn't really think about doing anything but folding with the 7-5 of hearts. Let's take a look at a more holistic view of how to defend this spot as the big blind. Let's explore where our calling thresholds are in this spot as big blind facing an R33. Again, that means range bet. As I said, there's quite a lot more raise than you would anticipate, 21.43% to be precise, calling 51% and folding 27% of the big blind's range. This is more than the pot odds norm, but not significantly so. The reason for this is that the button has adopted a range bet strategy. The closer button gets to betting everything in their range, the less often that big blind is going to need to overfold relative to the pot odds norm. Had button chosen a bigger sizing here or bet more selectively, this fold equity would start to soar. Here's the overall strategy. As we can see, the defense thresholds go right down to all of the ace high in this situation. We are defending all kinds of ace high here, almost regardless of suit, because this is a range bet from our opponent and we always have at least live pair draws, an overcard to the king, and backdoor straight draws of course. We can even make some defends that are as loose as queen jack, although this is an indifferent hand. When we get to the lower cards, you can see that with holdings like 7-5, there's a little bit of folding in there, but that's only going to be the dead suit, which is hearts. Not only is the 7-5 of hearts going to give us less prospects for making the nuts and less ways to win a big pot later, but it's also going to unblock the folding range of your opponent. When your opponent R33s, meaning bets range, all of the heart combos are going to be in there as often as the diamond and club combos, with the exception of obviously the cards on the board. That means that villain isn't choosing to c-bet 7-6 of hearts less than 7-6 of diamonds, and so it's particularly important to unblock that dead suit and block the live ones. It's not just equity that causes you to select backdoors as bluffs. So while we can't see the suit distribution here, I hope you're getting a sense for what's going on. We fold slightly more than pot odds norm here. It would be more if villain wasn't betting with whole range. Our showdown value threshold is something like ace 7. This hand can call, it can fold, it can also throw in a weird raise because the ace pair draw is sort of nutted in terms of being as nutted as a one pair hand can possibly be, and there's not really an issue with having a hand like this in your raising range as long as your opponent is betting often enough that you're not at a huge disadvantage. When people bet range, they're usually stretching the GTO recommendation a little bit and betting with a slightly weaker range than they're supposed to, technically speaking. We need to adapt our strategy in accordance with this. Our non-showdown value threshold consists of some bizarre looking combos. Calling here with the Jack-8 of spades might not be something that floats your boat at first sight. Same with 10-9 of clubs, and especially true of 9-6 of spades. With the Jack-8 of spades, let's take this one as a sort of demonstrative factor that allows us to understand when, why and where we can actually make these kinds of defense. First off, I want to stress that hitting a Jack or an 8 will actually normally make us the best hand. You might dismiss these cards because they are often dead against the king, but your opponent's betting with a very wide range here and is going to be extremely fortunate if they actually land here with top pair. It's hard to have King X. While it's a great card for button's range, doesn't mean it hits the majority or anything close to that. Moreover, we're going to have future fold equity. We are not calling the turn out of position here just to check and lose on the river with Jack high. All too often I hear students say things like, we can't call because we don't have any showdown value. But when it's on a really early street, that's not actually important. How much do you care about flatting the 7-5 suited out of the big blind against a cutoff open? You don't worry that 7 high is too low to have showdown value because you're so far from showdown. Yes, 3 of the 5 cards have come down already, but there's still 2 to go, and 7-5 is going to have the chance to bluff the river later if it's not lucky enough to backdoor into something or hit a pair. Obviously it's better to just hit the river and not have to bluff, but the future fold equity that we obtain here by calling and the turn going check check is really valuable, as we saw a lot in grade 1, because we actually get a lot more fold equity than the pot odds norm in those river situations where we've called flop and turn is checked through. That's because we land in a favourable world on the river after we've condensed our range by calling flop and shedding our worst hands like the 7-6 of hearts. 10-9 is slightly better, you could argue, but according to the solver it's just as indifferent. The one thing this hand can do a bit more often is raise more, and that's because it has more ways of backdooring into something nutted. When you play a really big pot, it does pay dividends to have some hands in your range that can hit the nuts, because that's going to bail your range out and actually cause a big swing from losing a big pot to winning a big pot really often. 10-9 of clubs is the sort of hand that stacks villain more often after raising flop and getting super lucky. Jack-8 can do that, but it's much worse at it than 10-9. That explains why Jack-8 is mixing call with fold, and 10-9 and 9-6 are mixing raise as well. The 9-6 of spades is a combo that looks pretty ghastly. I can forgive you for just folding this all the time, and indeed in equilibrium, if you run this sim, you'll probably get a fold verdict. The reason for that is that I've locked the solver to bet range here, whereas your sim will probably only bet about 70% of the time on this flop. I could be wrong and it depends on your inputs, but a lot of people will not get a range bet verdict here when they input a flop like this. Let's learn about some geographical points. What is this? If you have an answer for me, great. If not, I'll go ahead and tell you. It's one of these things you either know or you don't, after a few seconds of thought. Would it help if I showed you it in this context? Probably helps a lot if you're from somewhere near here. You can almost see where I'm from in this map, which is Scotland. In fact, you probably can at the very top there. But if you come from somewhere else in the world, you may have no idea. It's not really your neighbourhood. If you know that this flag and this location on the map denote this country as Belgium, then you're more likely to remember next time that when you see the shape in isolation that that's what the country is. Not many people know that this is Belgium when I show them the first figure. I've shown about 50 Carrot Poker School students that took this course live, and I think out of them only 2 or 3 have actually managed to get it before seeing the second picture. We can refer to this practice of identifying the cutoff point between an action becoming permissible and impermissible as range geography. What we did on the last slide is we looked at the worst hand that we could raise, the best hand that was just a call and not a value raise, the 3-way mix point between call, fold and raise where all actions are 0. These are geographic points in the sense that if you can see where they are in the range and you can sort of have a feel for what the range is overall, you're way more likely to identify these points. Whereas if you just see a random hand and have no context and no real formal poker education on these spots, it's going to be really tough to figure out where that hand fits into the strategy. It wouldn't make sense when trying to memorize the location of Belgium or learning some attributes about the country that would allow future recognition to actually memorize cities in France, cities in Germany, cities in the Netherlands. That wouldn't be the highest EV or most efficient way of doing things. It's sufficient merely to look at the bordering countries, to memorize their shapes, and to know that Great Britain, France, Germany, etc. are nearby. Similarly, when we're looking at ranges, we don't have to memorize a complete strategy. We don't need to know that the capital of Denmark is Copenhagen, and we don't need to know that some hand at the bottom of your range is a fold to know that your thin value bets that mix call and raise are things like weak top pair, backdoor flush draw. You just have to remember the threshold that actually matters, which is the border between one part of your range and another, not the entire map. As long as we have certain reference points, we're going to be okay. The same holds true in poker. As long as we know where these thresholds are when we face a bet, we can do the same thing. The main thresholds that I'd like you guys to basically install as a routine in your thought process when you're facing flop bets are the following. First off, you need to have a good feel for the bottom of your value raising range. These are the weakest combos that don't lose EV by trying to value raise. Of course, if you play against somebody who overbluffs the turn barrel node or overfolds to the flop raise or both, you're not going to want to raise these hands anymore, but they are the break-even point at equilibrium. As a side note, I'd like to add that another benefit of understanding thresholds is that if you know where indifference points and cusps are between one range and another, you know how to shift exploitatively and you can see the first hands to change your strategy with. The first hands you want to modify your play with when you're exploiting an opponent are the ones that would be very torn in equilibrium between 2 or more options. The bottom of your value range is an excellent example of something that can shift very easily in real life once you take real life factors into consideration. The robustness threshold is the point in your range where a made hand is indifferent between calling and folding. A made hand need not denote a pair. A made hand could simply be something with showdown value like good ace high or king high. The idea with the robustness threshold is that if you call a hand that's on the cusp of this, then that hand will usually not need to bluff later to win, nor will it always need to improve to win, though it may be able to bluff on certain runouts and improve on others, but for the most part the hand is going to be good enough to risk no more money and still have an okay pot share by checking down, provided that villain doesn't bet the turn. The robustness threshold is a key point to identify, and it's usually a bit lower down than you would think in late position wide range battles and against range bets, and possibly higher up than you would think when you're against an earlier position or you're in a tighter configuration, or maybe when villain is using a bigger sizing or more polarized or selective c-bet strategy. The frailness threshold, this is the part of your range where everything comes together. A frail hand is one that isn't surviving in terms of showdown value and needs other things to happen to call. When you call a frail hand, it's like calling the jack 8 suited on the king 3 deuce with the backdoor flush draw. You're not going to showdown jack high. If you call and turn goes check check, it's simply because you have a profitable river bluff that you get over the designated EV target for calling that hand on the flop. If you couldn't bluff river, you wouldn't be able to call flop. So the frailness threshold really concerns hands that could go either way. They could call, they could raise, they could fold, because all of the actions are zero on this threshold. These are not hands that are rich in showdown value. They will have some form of nut potential. You're never going to raise total junk against a flop c-bet unless your opponent has gone very wrong and built way too wide of a range. If your opponent is building a suitably wide c-bet range for the spot in question that gels with their range advantage, there's not really anything you can do with the absolute bottom of your range. You don't want to raise with nothing in an unfavourable world, and facing a c-bet out of position on a board that's not good for you is most definitely an unfavourable world. So let's reiterate these thresholds just to make sure that we understand this stuff. It is very important to get this right. Firstly, the bottom of our value range again is going to be key because it shows you the weakest hand you can get away with value raising. You always want to know where this is, and the most common leak people have in practice is not knowing and actually missing then value raises, hence not really applying enough pressure and not really punishing someone who c-bets too often, a very common leak. The robustness threshold concerns hands that might not need to bluff to win, that have quite a lot of showdown value and needn't improve either. Robustness threshold hands are exactly in the middle between calling and folding because they have some showdown value, but it's flimsy and it's questionable. Frailness threshold hands don't have enough showdown value to call and check down. If they can call, it's because they can bluff later / improve, and they may also just choose to aggress immediately and raise right off the bat. More thresholds now. Let's take this spot. This is one that's a little bit less natural to R33. You can do this, and there's not really a massive theoretical EV loss on a board like this associated with range betting 33% pot. It's not completely normal though, and if someone knows that you're doing this, they do play a lot of raises, and that's going to force you to defend quite counterintuitively as button. In any case, let's see what happens when button bets all of their range on this texture. Where's the bottom of your value range? I want you to consider that my main reason for showing you how to play against range bets is that many coaching for profit stables, coaches and training sites across the world teach their students to just simplify the betting range because it's easy and it means not having to face turn probes or deal with delayed c-bet situations on many boards. By cutting these junctures out of the game tree, they make the game tree more manageable for their horses or students and allow them to learn key profitable plays in other areas more easily by not overloading the player. However, if you really want to understand how to play poker more optimally, you shouldn't really bet range on these spots. I have another argument for checking back, which is that I actually think that people exhibit more leaks ostensibly against flop checks than they do against flop bets. I'm not advocating the way the button is playing here as the best strategy, but it's certainly one you'll come across very frequently, and so it's worth knowing what to do against it. The bottom of your value range, if you've not paused the video and had a bash, you probably should at this point. I'll tell you the answer now. First, I'll introduce the other thresholds. You may as well do them all at once. So have a look at A to D here. Bottom of value range, robustness threshold, below the frailness threshold, so meaning a hand that's a bit too weak to call. It could be way too weak to call, but can actually raise. This is the thing. On the flops, some hands can raise but not call. And then a hand that is bang on the frailness threshold that has enough going on to call, but could also fold. It's break even to call and could also raise. Have a bash at this now. Let's go over the answers. So the bottom of your value range should be something like this. Note that I've chosen these weak pairs that actually have hearts in them and not spades. We saw this pattern previously in grade 1, but if you have spades here, it actually makes it a little bit thinner to value raise because there aren't as many backdoors in villain's range that can call you. If you want to get called by the ace jack of spades here, you actually don't want to have the ace of spades in your hand. Clubs is another story. But queen 5 and ace 8 are both completely fine to raise as long as your opponent is merging here by betting all of their range. You don't have to be building a massive pot just because you're raising these hands immediately. In fact, a very common way of playing both of these holdings is to raise flop, benefiting from the mixed bag of reasons that is basically taught by the betting sink analogy, and then slow down on a later street by blocking or checking. Fairly normal stuff. Robustness threshold hands here are much lower than you would think. Something like king jack is actually okay to call, but ace 9 isn't. These hands are really similar to one another. The main difference is that king jack has more overcards to certain pairs and better backdoor straight draws. Calling a c-bet with king jack of diamonds here is pretty repulsive to most people, but once your opponent is c-betting range, it becomes okay. The sick thing is that if you actually fold king jack of diamonds all of the time and other hands of this ilk, you're going to be overfolding against the range bet. That's problematic because you're justifying someone playing a less sound strategy. You do get away with range betting boards like this. It's not going to cost you anything in real life, theoretically. But if you can be one of the people that doesn't let pull away with that, then at least you'll be profiting from their slight deviation. I would recommend that when a hand is close between raising as a bluff or calling versus folding, that you actually continue with it against most people who are betting range, because it's quite hard to protect yourself and end up not just giving up too often on hands once you've done that. A hand that's an example of something below the frailness threshold but can still raise is 10-6. This hand doesn't have robust enough pair draws to call. It's not surviving often enough on enough runouts on this flop texture to make a call plus EV, and call is negative EV here, but raising is break even. The reason the solver doesn't do this very often is not because it's bad. If it was bad, it would never do it, remember. It doesn't do it very often because of counter-exploitation considerations. If you flood your range with 10-6 of spades, you make it extremely easy for in position to defend everything, and it actually legitimizes the range bet in the first place once they have that exploit against you. And hands on the frailness threshold are things like ace 5, because it's barely good enough to call. It has a little bit of robustness to it, but I wouldn't really class it as a robust hand, but it's not 10 high, and it does have an overcard to the queen. Having good pair draws can also give you more robustness. Pair draws come in more than backdoor draws, so the strength of them can actually be more important to whether a hand can be continued. For example, the ace 5 actually has more in the way of an overcard immediately. That's a very good pair draw to have, and that explains why it's actually callable before something like 10-6, even though it has possibly worse backdoor draws. Here are some range geographical deductions from this data. All hands stronger than weak top pair will have a raise frequency. We know that because we can see weak top pair raising. This is going to increase exponentially as hands get exponentially stronger, and as we get up to really nutted hands that unblock the queen, such as 8s or 4s or 2 pair, we're going to actually consider raising these hands pure, especially against a range bet. We'll see this more in lecture 10. All hands weaker than king 10 of diamonds with equally low nut potential will be pure folds. We know this because the king jack is the last bastion of a hand we can call. Ace of hearts 5 of clubs falls exactly in the border between frail and robust, having enough nut potential to mix raise in sometimes. Remember, that's always a consideration. To mix in raise, you want ways to be bailed out in really big pots. That's the theme. Let's try to understand what a three-way mix is doing, because this is a really key hand class for understanding the rest of your range. We've seen already that a hand can be indifferent between betting and checking when we fill the betting sink enough to exceed the can bet line. Remember, the betting sink derives its EV, or derives its fullness I should say, from 3 taps: value, bluffing and denial. On the flop it's very much a mixed bag, and oftentimes hands are betting for a myriad of different reasons. There won't be any reasons other than these 3 however. Anything else you can think of, like making the hand easier for you to play, is secondary and not really part of game theory. It is possible that you're more familiar with one line than the other, and therefore you should adopt that line, or that your opponent is less familiar, but these are actually closer to exploitative considerations than game theory ones. If you cannot exceed the must bet line, then you will just be mixing bet with check, or in this case, call with raise. So just as we were comparing bet and check in the betting sink, we can compare call and raise. We have a two-way mix whenever both call and raise are positive and when the solver thinks the EV is similar. Remember that the solver's opponent is always setting out to try to make as many things indifferent as is feasible without losing EV itself, and therefore we need to be careful that we don't overlook a situation in reality where things are quite different. But when this same EV happens to be 0, the call-fold threshold is basically what we're going to see on the solver screen, and both call and raise will have exactly the same EV as folding. Two-way mixes basically mean that call and raise are both fine, but when it so happens that that EV is also 0, then call, raise, and fold are fine because all three actions have the EV of 0. This is way more common in game theory than you would think, and this creates a mix between everything. The reason you want to get good at identifying these is that they're really important for identifying where you are in your range. Being good at three-way mixes is a good skill because it's a bit like having a legend to a map or suddenly seeing the outline of a country that you recognize and being able to piece together what the neighboring countries must be. If you know where your three-way mixes begin and end on many boards, you'll be able to construct the rest of your range around that in just the same way as you're able to piece together a jigsaw puzzle by finding a key feature, like a sunset or possibly a house. Three-way mixes, big blind versus button when we're facing B75, go as follows. If we have a flop of Jack 3 deuce rainbow, a hand like Queen 9 against a big bet would be a three-way mix. This hand looks too strong to ever fold based on facing an R33, but this time we're facing a more selective, more polarized strategy, against which we're going to want to raise less, and we're facing it in a situation where villain is using a bigger sizing and our pot odds are worse, so calling is going to be a worse proposition here than average, as is raising for the average hand. That said, Queen 9 is good enough to continue sometimes, and it can do so by calling or by raising, but because neither of these things is meant to be profitable, the hand can also fold. It's impossible to make a mistake with Queen 9 of clubs on this flop unless you use a ridiculous raise size. There's no way you can go wrong here. You could literally give this spot to a rank beginner and they could not make a mistake in this situation. Not theoretically at least. Same with this hand. No matter what you do here, you cannot go wrong. Another reason psychologically why it's important to identify three-way mixes is that when you can see that nothing really matters, it takes the pressure off. There's nothing more counterproductive in poker than obsessing about whether your play was a call or a raise and looking at all these half-baked EV ideas when actually game theory's considered all of the EV ideas already and determined that it's just the same EV. You know which hands are the same EV to call, fold and raise. You don't have to drive yourself mad with this kind of questioning and self-doubting. 5-4 on King Queen 4 is maybe a bit more surprising. This time we have more showdown value, but our draws are not as good as in the second case, and we don't really have a lot of stability with this hand, meaning that when villain is bluffing, they're going to have a ton of outs against our lowly pair of fours. So this hand is very vulnerable. You can see why this hand might want to raise when you think about the betting sink. You can be called here by hands like Jack 10, Ace Jack, Ace 10, flush draws, etc. You can even get peeled by some backdoor hands that you're doing well against, or Jack 9 or something. And that's the value region pretty much covered, the value component or tap pretty much covered. When it comes to bluffing, villain is going to be betting maybe a few better 4x here that could fold, possibly something like a pocket pair, although I think those will usually check, but I think something like 5s or 6s could possibly bet fold here. But it will mostly be value and denial, and there's a ton of denial. While denial is never a big factor as we saw last time, there's a lot of it here because our pair is so small. What I mean when I say there's a lot of it is that almost any combination in villain's range, no matter how bad, will have at least 6 outs. Take a hand at the very bottom of villain's range like the 9-8 of spades. That hand is utter garbage, but it's going to be able to bluff flop sometimes because the flop is so favourable. 5-4 when it raises will fold villain out of 6 outs. That's possibly 24% equity, though that will depend on the exact texture. The rule of 2 and 4 are roughly good, but they're not perfect. But it's a lot of equity in any case to be making your opponent fold. So as we can see, there are lots of different reasons to raise all of these hands. The first two are squarely just bluffs, although there's a little bit of denial to a hand like Queen 9 if villain folds a pair draw that's lower, but for the most part, you need to learn where three-way mixes are so that you can figure out where you are in your range in relation to that. For example, if I was dealt a hand like Ace 10 of diamonds, if I know that Queen 9 of clubs is a continue in the first flop, I can figure out that Ace 10 of diamonds just being a better hand with equal backdoors is not actually able to fold. If Queen 9 is the indifference point, Ace 10 of clubs or Ace 10 of diamonds, anything with a backdoor, would never be a fold. That's the utility in this concept. Let's move on to reacting to lazy range bets. These days a lot of players revert to R33 even on boards like this one where it costs them some money theoretically. Lazy range bets are bets that shouldn't really be a thing, that do cost significant EV and that you should avoid, but there are many training stables that get their players to play in this way. The reason is that they get away with it in practice even if it's supposed to cost something against a more theoretically sound opponent. Let's look at the differences between how we should react to a range bet here and how we react to a normal bet. You guys will be running HUDs, you'll have CBET stats on certain sites, so you'll be playing live and develop some reads on the players around you, and you may well be able to pick up on who's just c-betting routinely here and who's actually being more selective. So against R33 we raise a whopping 33% of the time, folding only 16%. That's almost 10% less than the pot odds norm, indicating that when villain range bets we actually end up in a favourable world. That's because villain's range is not entitled to use such widespread aggression on a board that's not that great and has a danger zone card. Normally, something with 2 deuces on it is pretty good for the opener because their overpairs become a lot better, but the two-tone, aka flush-drawn nature of this board is going to reduce the strength of those hands. A hand like Queens is going to run into a flush much more often and get counterfeited here than it would on a rainbow board. Against B33 the raising drops to 16%, that's half as much raising, but that's what we should expect when we think about Clark's theorem and just how much more polarized villains' range is if they adhere to a more theoretically sound c-bet strategy on this board compared to when they're range betting. Calling comes in at 58%, similar, and now folding is just around the pot odds norm. What's going on here is that we're out of position, but the board is good for us, and that trade-off neutralizes itself out to cause pot odds norm fold equity. Again, it's not mathematical and it's not automatic, it's just that coincidentally the factors even themselves out when we have a board like 5 deuce deuce in this situation. Some example hands here could be something like 10-6, which is a completely normal fold when a villain is building a normal theoretical c-bet strategy. If you look this up in your own sims, you're going to see this hand fold probably because it will be playing against a selective c-bet strategy that I'm guessing would be no more than about 50% of hands. When the opponent's betting 100% instead of 50%, it's obviously a very large strategic shift, and now 10-6 can call or raise. You'll note that I've listed the EVs there on the right hand side. It's not a massive loss there to go ahead and actually raise this hand or call this hand anyway, and you would absolutely want to do that against somebody who is overfolding even if they weren't betting their range on the flop. This is the first sort of hand that I would recommend a student pure raises as soon as they suspect that pool isn't meeting the defense frequency that's required. When pool is range betting, they're far less likely to hit the defense frequency than if they're building a selective c-bet range. Pocket 8s is a similar thing. The raise frequency goes up. This is more just because we are now obliged to use a certain amount of raises to hold our opponent accountable. If they're range betting and we drop that raise frequency, they start to realize more equity than they deserve to. But we're handcuffed a little bit here. We can't raise all of the time, not because there's any problem with that in a vacuum, but just because it would be a departure from equilibrium and there would be ways of countering it. Mainly villain would just start building a stronger c-bet range and punishing the fact we're raising too often. 8-6 of diamonds is the epitome of a hand that really shifts in EV. It moves from losing a little bit to break even as a call. Calling this hand looks absurd. It's something that basically nobody will do, but when villain is actually betting the flop here with everything, the thing is that their turn check back frequency becomes insanely high. The solver, having bet everything on the flop, kind of gets a fright and is like, oh no, I've reached the turn with all of these combos. What am I going to do? And it starts checking back at a really high frequency, realizing that its range is getting punished. In this spot in reality, this hand is hard to pull the call trigger with here, but if you can do it, try to understand that 1, you only need 20% pot entitlement in EV to call. You have pair draws and backdoor straight draws, but most notably, villain will have to check back the turn a lot having c-bet a flop like this, and you will get that favourable bluff opportunity on the river, plus the chance to realize all of your equity. It's much better than it looks, although it's still just break even. But it looks like it should be hemorrhaging money, not if villain is range betting, that's the key. So as we can see, it's very important to run sims in spots where you think pool is range betting a lot or where you think a player is range betting with R33 locked into the solver. In Pile Solver 2, it's very easy to do this. All you have to do is tick the box that says force out of position check, in position bet. On other solvers or built-in browser solvers, it will be far more difficult to do this or maybe impossible. If you own your own custom solver, this is one benefit of that. Let's think about being in position now. Some opponents will even try to range bet when they're out of position on a less favourable board. Small blind on average will lose 0.12 BBs by choosing to range bet this texture. This is a meaningful error. To put this in perspective, losing a tenth of a big blind is like opening a hand that's comfortably outside of your opening range pre-flop. An example, off the top of my head, could be something like opening a hand like the Jack-8 of hearts under the gun. It's not going to be a massive loser, but over the long term it's going to add up, and if you did that all the time you would lose due to the sheer commonness of that spot. This spot isn't super common, but it's definitely not rare either, and so range betting here against someone that knows how to react is a big mistake. The thing is though, that many coaches tell their students to play this way because they don't get punished. Big blind has no idea what to do against a range bet here because they've only studied looking at a selective c-bet strategy. I'm not saying you should go out and accuse every opponent of range betting flops like this that are meant to be bet 30% of the time or something. Not everyone's going to play this way, but the lower you play and the higher the c-bet percentage on the HUD, the more likely it is that that opponent is just betting. A lot of people at soft live games or microstakes online just see an ace and assume it's a spot where their range wants to bet a lot, forgetting that, or maybe just not realizing that the polarization of your range as the big blind is very high on this board, and their range is much more merged by comparison, containing more combos of king, queen, king, jack, kings, queens, jacks, tens, nines, etc., medium strength hands. Here's again the difference between how we react to an R33 and a B33. Against the R33, things are a bit crazy. We're raising 24% of the time even though we're in position. The reason that should maybe surprise you is that urgency is lower in position when we face a bet, but higher when we face a check. As we're facing a bet here, we wouldn't really expect to be doing this much raising. Against B33 though, it's much more normal, raising 9%, folding again slightly over pot odds norm, calling 65. What's really striking is that against range bet, we're only folding 19% of the time. That means calling some hands that look a bit iffy to call. King 10 of hearts is a hand that you would not feel nice about calling here. It's a flush draw on the board, you don't have it, you don't even have a spade, you seem to block dead suits that would just be folding. The thing is that when you're in position, it's much easier to realize pair draw, equity, implied odds from just making a small thin value bet later on a king or 10 run out, as well as being able to extract fold equity later on. The reason for this is that when the opponent has the bottom of their range on the turn, because they're out of position, they'll be in a less favourable world and will actually have to give up all the time with certain air hands. This will guarantee a large amount of equity realisation. Of course, if your opponent's playing in a way where they're just c-betting random stuff on the turn anyway, you won't want to peel this hand just to end up folding a lot later. King 10 of hearts on the right hand side is just break even. Against someone that's concocting a good strategy, this hand shouldn't be making much as a call. 8-7, this is a hand that again looks like air, but it has multiple backdoors and a pair draw. You don't want to forget that pair draw. I know I sound like a broken record on the pair draw front, but it is important. And this hand is a huge mistake to fold on the left hand side, a smaller mistake to fold on the right, and actually becomes a pure raise on the left because as your opponent's range becomes more merged, you want to use more large investments. Raising is a large investment, therefore we raise this hand all the time. Ace 5 of hearts, this is one that's going to be basically just to continue all the time, and you don't have to fast play it on the left hand side, but because you want a bigger global frequency against the range bet that's on the left hand side, you'll have a higher raise frequency. These things aren't that important, and I'm not going to sit here and demand that you guys try to hit GTO frequencies. I just want you to understand the concept that someone has more mediocre hands in their range and is betting more loosely on the flop. You need to raise more in general to punish that strategy, and so having a higher raise frequency with the value hands in your range facilitates that in the long term. Hope that makes sense. It's not that raising is necessarily better than calling in either case. It's just how you want to build your strategy to be not exploitable basically against the way they're playing. I do understand that these things are not major considerations. I hope you guys are seeing now that how unexploitable you are and how balanced you are is not really what GTO is about. It's not really what theory is about. It's a luxurious side benefit. It's not the main goal. The main goal of studying game theory is to understand EV and to maximize it. Let's look at fold frequencies relative to the pot odds norm. And I'm going to give you a figure that's a little bit more general, but should illustrate how we can understand which flops we're supposed to fold much more on relative to this mathematical reference point and which ones would fold less. On the x-axis here, we have being out of position versus being in position. And we have this on the left-hand side for bad flops, first of all, for the defender, that's for the big blind caller, and then for good flops. This vertical line just separates the good flops from the bad flops so that we can look at out of position versus in position in each type of situation on each texture. The pot odds norm fold equity is here, so irrespective of the bet size, the pot odds norm will always be the amount that would cause the bettor to break even if they had no equity, and this is purely arbitrary and will not reflect the real life fold equity. It's just a reference point so you can understand how good or bad the world is for your range. Pot odds norm is going to be 43% against 75% pot. It's going to be 25% against 1/3 pot. Those are the main ones you need to know for the flop. What we see is that when we're out of position on a bad flop for the defender and we're facing a well-constructed range that's maybe not betting with everything, it's just betting the 75% or whatever it's supposed to, we have massive overfolding going on. We even slightly overfold against range bets when we're out of position on bad flops for our range. Try and remember that as a rough baseline. In position, we will never really be overfolding to a c-bet apart from on the very worst boards and in 3-bet pots in particular. But in position in a single raise pot, blind versus blind, it's going to be really rare that we overfold because small blind is just dealing with a very weak range and being out of position. The ranges are so diluted, small blind versus big blind, it's less of a big deal that small blind has all of the overpair combos and big blind does not. So in position, against the B33 on a bad flop, we'll still get close to hitting that pot odds norm fold equity and reaching MDF because of our positional advantage. When villain range bets, we might even be over defending our range even though the flop is bad for us. Very strange, but you have to think about all of these factors. On good flops for the defender, the green here on the right hand side, we're going to be doing a lot more defending, of course, and now the overfolding that goes on is not going to be so much. We're going to be barely even overfolding to the B33 now, and against the R33 we'll actually be underfolding even out of position. If we're in position and villain dares to R33 on a board that's good for us, the fold equity drops down to almost nothing. If you're in a 3-bet pot and the board is 6-5-3 and you think your opponent's just range bet 1/3 pot, don't fold anything. Promise you, we'll see this in lecture 9. Against B33, that basically assumes that villain has taken the diligence here to work out what their strategy should be and avoid just betting indiscriminately and completely merged, and therefore we need to be a bit more selective, but we're still going to be underfolding due to being in position. Let's talk now about bluff catching to wrap up this lecture. I'm going to introduce a system today that will allow us to label hands within 3 different belts and then 3 sub-belts for one of those 3 different belts. It sounds more complicated than it is. But once we can assign a hand a label, we will feel way more confident about facing bets and we'll have a much better idea of where we are in that crucial range geography that allows us to know where the calling ranges begin and end and where we should just be folding. Let's get into it. Let's start by defining what we mean by a bluff catcher. When we're facing a bet, a bluff catcher is going to be any hand that's an equity favourite versus all of villain's bluffs, every single one of them, and an equity underdog against all of villain's value hands. This might sound like a really specific definition, but because our opponent's range is inherently polarized when they bet, we're going to have a lot of bluff catchers. Villain will be checking behind most of their medium strength hands, and therefore building a betting range that's almost exclusively hands that beat our bluff catcher or hands that we beat. On the river, very strong hands and very weak hands will equate to 100 and 0% equity respectively. Here, a bluff catcher is very simple to apply and it's extremely useful. It's basically completely true in its purest sense. On the flop, and even more so pre-flop, equities will run too close together for bluff catcher to be a useful term, thus we'll only introduce it from the turn onwards. Imagine being pre-flop with a hand like King-Queen and saying, I'm going to call here, but this is a bluff catcher. It doesn't really make sense because the villain is bluffing with Ace-4 suited, they're beating you, technically, although it's very, very close. And if they're value betting, yeah, you're still completely dead most of the time, but not always, because you're in good shape against something like jacks. So it doesn't really work on these earlier streets. It doesn't even really work on the flop either, where people are range betting merged hands for all kinds of taps flowing in the betting sink. Check out last lecture if you don't know what I'm talking about. You should have watched that first, really. If a hand is not strong enough to be an equity favourite versus all the villain's bluffs, we're going to refer to it as a frail hand. Frail hand does not necessarily mean hopeless or weak. You could have a frail hand with something going for it, like a flush draw, straight draw, open-ender, pair draw, etc. If a hand is strong enough to be a chop or equity favourite against any of villain's value hands, even just one, we're going to refer to it as a value beater. So if I have ace-queen and the board is ace-high, and I think the bottom of your value range when you bet pot is ace-queen, I actually have a value beater technically because I can chop with one of your value hands. In GTO terms, value beaters are pretty much always calls, with a few very bizarre exceptions aside. But in reality, of course, if someone is grossly underbluffing, you might even fold a value beater, but do understand that frail hands with nothing going on are typically folds. Value beaters are always calls because they're better than bluff catchers, and it's really in the bluff catcher region, the most abundant region, that we end up being closer to indifferent, and where we have to look at some very specific and difficult factors like removal effects, equity against value hands, and equity against bluffs. A bluff catcher can be classified as either Class A, Class B, or Class C based on how well it scores in those three areas. How good is my equity against my opponent's value hands? In other words, if I'm calling on the turn, and it must be the turn here, otherwise I can't have any equity against value hands with a bluff catcher, or I've misdefined the hand, and I'm on the turn here, you've bet, I need to ask myself, how can I redraw against your value range? If I think your value range is top pair over pairs 2-pair plus, what kind of outs do I have to 2-pair or trips? That's going to be a big part of whether or not I should call. For example, pairs on the board are usually much better at this than pocket pairs off the board. Equity versus bluffs. People don't really consider this, but why is it that solvers don't like calling the turn with underpairs to the board? Usually it's because even where villain is bluffing, if there are 2 overcards there, it's not just the gut shot that they have, but it's overcards pretty much all the time. Imagine calling with a pair of 4s on Jack 10 6 5. The problem is that no matter what villain's hand is, it's got huge equity even when you have the best hand. Blockers are basically the bread and butter of choosing between bluff catchers. On the river, they're the only thing that matters. They become the be-all and end-all because there is of course no equity versus bluffs or equity versus value hands to consider. A villain is bluffing, it's a binary thing, you just win. A villain is value betting, you lose if you have a bluff catcher, otherwise you misdefine the holding, like I say. On the turn, blockers are going to combine with these things to matter. On the river, they're going to become the only thing that matters when choosing which bluff catchers to call in game theory. The bluff catching system works as follows. It's a great pleasure for me to introduce this to you because it's helped so many students throughout the years that I've been doing private coaching with it since I first created the Carrot Poker School. As a live course, it's helped 50 to 100 people, something like that, and this is always pretty much people's favourite part of the lecture. So we're going to respond to a bet on the turn or river by dividing our non-draw hands. We'll ignore draws for now because they are a bit different. They are technically frail hands, but we'll come back to them in lecture 10 as we talk about raising a bit more in the turn and things like that. We'll also talk about them more in lecture 8. But ignoring them for now, we'll look at the made hands in our range, we'll leave raising off the table, and we'll think closely about how to divide up these made hands into the following categories. Firstly, we're going to determine whether they're frail, bluff catchers, or value beaters, remembering that a frail hand is a combo that's going to lose to at least one bluff combo. Bluff catchers are hands that beat every bluff but lose to all value hands, and value beaters chop or win against at least one combination that villain bets in theory for value. When we have a bluff catcher, it's not clear what we should do, and thus we should split it up between grade A, grade B, and grade C. These are determined again by equity to improve on the turn against our opponent's value bets, equity against bluffs, meaning how easily can villains' bluffs improve against us on the turn, and blockers, but on the river it's just going to be blockers. When we have a frail hand with no redraw, because we're leaving draws off the table for now, we're always going to fold to a bet. When we have a bluff catcher, it's going to depend on the sizing villain uses and the grade of our bluff catcher, whether or not we want to call. If we have a value beater, we're going to always be calling in theory. Please remember at all times this is a theoretical course. Don't call off any bluff catcher in any spot where you think your opponent is significantly under bluffing. The number of our bluff catchers that we shall call will depend on villain sizing and the world favourability. If we're out of position, we might have to be much tighter than if in position because the EV will be lower if continuing, we're in a less favourable world. Let's look at an example of this in practice before we wrap up for today and get to the homework. Cutoff goes ahead and B75s this turn, having already c-bet the flop. We'll skip straight to the turn because this is the street we care about. Our bluff catching system looks like this. I've just flipped it 90 degrees so it fits better on the slide, but it's the same thing. And here we have the range. Can you figure out where a value beater would be here? What would be a grade A bluff catcher, a grade B bluff catcher, and a grade C bluff catcher? And where would your frail hands come in? Try and figure it out, take some notes, pause the video, and let's go through the answers when you're ready. Okay, let's go. This is what we see. Color-coded correspondence here between the hands and the bluff catcher system on the left. Starting at the bottom with frail hands, we can see that ace-jack offsuit has got itself an orange rectangle. This hand is frail because villain is actually also allowed to bluff some ace-jack combos on this node. Villain is not allowed to bluff ace-king here, and if this was button, may not even be able to bluff as high as ace-jack, because that's a reasonable hand there. But when villain is cut off or earlier, ace-jack is going to be bet at some frequency in equilibrium on this turn as a bluff, and therefore when holding ace-jack suited ourselves, we have to just accept that we don't beat all bluff combos. For that reason, we have to go ahead and pure fold. This is a frail hand with no nutted redraw. Moving on to bluff catchers now. The worst bluff catcher we have pictured there is sixes. That's a grade C bluff catcher, meaning that it's not profitable to continue that hand. To understand why, think about the 3 factors for turn grading of bluff catcher that I outlined on the previous slide. Firstly, sixes does not have a lot of redraw against our opponent's value region. Only 2 outs to be precise, and there are even rare exceptions where none of them are good. Secondly, when villain is bluffing, they will almost always have 2 overcards to our lowly sixes. And thirdly, the blockers of this hand are negative. We're not blocking a single value combo for this sizing in villain's range, but we are blocking some bluffs, such as 6-5 suited, or even something like king 6, jack 6. We've seen before that these hands can bet. Maybe jack 6 is a bit low, but you get the point. Moving up to grade B bluff catchers, we have 8s. This is a similar hand to 6s, but it's now break even instead of losing. The reason for this is basically just that villain's bluffs have less equity against us now on average when we have 2 8s. While a hand like jack 10 won't really care whether we have 8s or whether we have 6s, a hand like 8-7 will. When we have 6s it has pair draws, and when we have 8s it has no pair draws. This is the difference, and it's bigger than you think. Sometimes in equilibrium, EV is balanced on a knife edge and it takes a very weak gust of wind to sway things in one direction. Finally, on the bluff catcher front, we have jack 9 suited, a hand that is a grade A bluff catcher. Not only does the 9 block some combos in villain's range, but it also gives us 5 out redraw against the queen, which is lovely, or against an overpair. And thirdly and finally, villain is going to struggle to have 2 overcards against this hand unless he has specifically something like king jack or king 10. And the jack isn't even live with king jack, so yeah, he's really going to struggle. So jack 9 is a very profitable call and never a hand you should consider folding yet. But it's not just because a 9 is higher than an 8, and an 8 is higher than a 6, it's due to these factors. So I hope we're learning how to grade a bluff catcher here. Again, 6s, 8s and jack 9 are all bluff catchers because they beat all bluffs in villain's range, but are behind all value hands for this sizing. Ace 9 is the first example, I think king 9 as well actually, of a value beater. What a hand like ace 9 does is it will do very well against king 9 and will chop with ace 9. And villain gets to bet as low down as king 9 here because the queen is a card that we usually fold on the flop. Whether he's bet 33% or 75% on the flop won't make a massive difference because we'll be folding a lot of queen x in relation to other stuff we fold against each size. It's true that we do continue more queen x against b33 than we do against b75, but the thing is it's going to be a similar portion of our range in each case. So ace 9 is a value beater, it's never a hand you should even fathom folding, and it's actually entitled to around 2 big blinds by continuing here in a small pot. That's huge. Throwing away 2 big blinds would be a massive mistake. Homework task 7 asks you to solve the following situation. You're big blind and you've called a 2.5 BB open from cutoff. You have at your disposal some evidence that suggests that cutoff is very likely to be range betting this flop of 7-7 deuce. You call and check the turn and you face a b75. So for the following 3 turns, I want you to identify points 1 to 5 here. So it's basically 15 problems to solve. Your worst value beater, a grade A bluff catcher, a grade B bluff catcher, a grade C bluff catcher, and a frail hand. Once you've done that, I will unpause the video. I'm going to show you a Pio sim and show you how to actually pinpoint these landmarks on a hand grid. Okay, let's go. So here we have Pio Solver. The flop is going to be a range bet, as we said. It's going to be check, bet flop, and we're going to make the call. Don't worry too much about our range at this point. We'll talk about this later. And then we're going to face a b75 on the turn. So the first turn is the queen of spades. We check, we face a b75. Villain can have 2 sizes here, but it's not a big deal. He's mostly using the b75 because the board is paired. b75 is the smallest bet in his toolkit here. That's why it has the orange color. And let's have a look at this spot. So in the queen of spades turn, our worst value beater. The way to figure this out if you're looking at a solver is to make an educated guess first of all. So I would think it's likely, and I'm doing this off the cuff completely, but I'm going to suggest it's something around, well, the queen wasn't present on the flop, so villain doesn't have to be too selective here about value betting. I'd imagine that villain can continue to value bet with something like 8s or better here. I'm going to say that 8s is our weakest value beater. Let's take a look. In villain's range, they were betting with Actually much wider than that, 6s and 5s as well, as kind of, I guess these are mostly value bets. Maybe you could call these hybrid bets, getting quite a lot of useful fold equity, but it seems that even something like 6s or 5s could be considered a value beater here. That's interesting, that's a bit lower than I thought. You see, I'm even learning stuff by going through this exercise. It's really useful. Number 2 is a grade A bluff catcher, a bluff catcher that's going to be very high EV. You can see that 4s and 3s are only grade B. These are actually good examples of grade B. They're mixing fold. Something that's grade C would be something that's pure folding but is a bluff catcher. In this case, I would think something like some kind of ace high of certain suits that is beating every bluff, but it's just the redraw is very bad and the hand is probably blocking some bluffs as well. And then we have a grade A bluff catcher, which would be something with a pair on the board. I guess your ace deuce, king deuce would be a good example of that, just pure calling. Your frail hands here are going to be things that can't beat all bluffs. We see here that villain is bluffing quite a lot of king high and even some ace high. So when we get to this turn with something like king jack that was quite strong on the flop, it's actually now just a frail hand due to its inability to beat all bluffs. The second turn we wanted to look at here was the ace of diamonds, and we're going to do the same thing for that card. When the ace of diamonds comes, our opponent takes a much more polarized approach. This is a bad turn for villain's range, but one on which they do have a pretty big nut advantage. Villain is using overbets on this card mainly, so what I'm actually going to do here is pause the video and force our opponent to use a b75 so that it fits with our homework task. You will see opponents use b75 in practice, so it's still useful to look at. As you can see, I've locked the strategy so that our opponent now has to use the b75. I think this will be more common actually in real life than the overbet will be, so it's a good thing to look at. And as you can see, this is villain strategy. Let's have a look at how we're supposed to play the given hands here in this homework task. Our worst value beater on this turn against b75, but let's try to find a reference point. Where will villain stop value betting? Will villain value bet things like kings, queens, jacks? Presumably not, although it is b75 now, but no. The villain is actually being really polarized here, betting sort of like ace 10, ace 9, sometimes ace 8 as a tiny sliver, never anything worse than ace 6. So our worst value beater can be again found by looking at villain's range, and it's going to be something like ace 9 in this situation. If you look at our EV, you'll see it falls off dramatically as we move from a value beater like ace 9 or ace 8 down to a pure bluff catcher like ace 6. A grade A bluff catcher would indeed be something like ace 6 that, while it isn't beating a value bet, is hugely good for beating bluffs and is going to unblock bluffs like broadways. They're going to have overcards to our pairs, and it's also going to be firmly blocking villain's value range, both 6-7 and ace 7, ace x. A grade B bluff catcher, just look for the hands that are mixing and try and learn where they are. Something like pocket 10s, pocket 9s, any pocket pair really, depending on suits, is going to be grade B. Note that when we look at a combo like 5s, we're never calling without the diamond. The reason we want the diamond is so that we can actually consume some of villain's outs in our hole cards, reducing the equity of their semi-bluffs. A grade C bluff catcher is something that will beat all bluffs but will always fold. A good example here is king queen. Villain won't be bluffing with king queen themselves. We look at their strategy here. So we do beat all bluffs, but it's a horrible hand that blocks bluffs and just has bad redraw. And villain always has pair draws against us, so very bad hand to call. Finally, for this one, a frail hand would be something in the vicinity of, I guess, bad king high. Is villain betting bad king high here? Or is he only betting queen high? That's what we have to look at. There's a bit of bad king high. So if we have something like king 8 here, that's going to be an example of a frail hand and very minus EV to call, as you can see. Let's take a look at the final turn card now, which is the 4 of hearts. To do that, I'll just go back to the original tree. Now there's enough of the smaller bet in there that I think this is worth looking at without a subtree. I mean, you could subtree this as well if you wanted a purer result for someone that was only using a smaller bet, but it's okay. I think this will give us a reasonable output. Wouldn't make a massive difference to strategy, I think you'll find, if you run it with the subtree. Anyway, let's not get lost in the weeds of solver use. Let's go over the answers. So our worst value beater in this situation, well, this is a more bricky card than the queen. I'd imagine the villain can value bet very far down here into their pocket pair region and probably maybe even value bet some hand like deuce x here or ace king ace queen as well. Let's take a look. So yeah, ace king ace queen are able to value bet, then it stops at ace jack. Therefore our worst value beater is going to be something like ace queen. We'll have a little bit of ace queen off here being in the cutoff. We won't have ace king, of course. Ace jack is going to be a grade B bluff catcher mixing, and ace queen is going to be a value beater. A grade A bluff catcher, here we have to try to find a hand that's actually pure calling even though it's only a bluff catcher. I guess ace jack of hearts could fit that bill because it has the extra redraw. It's like a fantastic bluff catcher, absolutely insane EV for that one. And then grade C, this would be a hand that's pure folding but does beat all bluff. Again, something like king jack here would be, it's hard to say, like villain might be betting some ace high here, but it's unclear whether this is like purely a bluff. I guess it is. The terminology is a little bit difficult to apply here, but something like that. Or if there's a particular suit of ace X that's high, yeah, like ace 9 of diamonds or something that's basically pure folding, something like this. Frail hand could just be something below, like again, the king jack, the king queen, that sort of thing, if villain's bluffing with ace 5 sometimes. So we found that exercise useful. Next time we are going to go over this in more detail. We're going to do loads more examples, and we're going to look at in position, out of position, turn, river, facing smaller bets, like blocks, facing bigger bets as well. We're going to look at all of it and become really proficient facing bets before we move on in lecture 9 to 3-bet pots. We're going to finish up with some raising situations in lecture 10. Hope you're enjoying grade 2 so far. Hope you're looking forward to setting the exam at the end of this course and moving on to grade 3. I will see you guys for lecture 8 next time. Bye for now.